We're gonna be talking about predicting human behavior today. I'm gonna share with you guys a little bit of my own experience um, and my own expertise. Okay, I got a lot of thumbs up. Thank you guys. I appreciate that. Um, as some of you might know, I have a good few years um, of experience working in therapy, social work, behavioral therapy, stuff like that. Um, with a slew of problematic peoples, right, as you would call them. Um, and the reason I wanted to talk about this topic is because this is a very in demand topic for some reason, right? All this talk about like gender dynamics and human behavior and yada yada. And there's a whole bunch of very niche and specific topics you can get into because well, human behavior is not simple. Um, but actually, when we compare it to human archetypes, it's very simple, right? So those are two things that intertwine very strangely. So maybe it's a good thing to sort of like explore that a little bit. Today's going to be a short one, but some very key, interesting insights I can share with you. So primarily, the question that is asked is why do humans do the things that they do, and why are humans the way they are? And particularly, well, obviously that also implies ourselves, but let's go a little bit into the external today and sort of like remove ourselves, our persona from, this whole thing. Just forget about yourself for a reason. And there's a very good reason, by the way. And let's think about other people and how we perceive other people, and why they do the things they do. To me, as someone who's been studying physiognomy and behavior for a very long time now, to me, how most interactions with people feel, and I'm being genuine here. I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm just sharing my genuine experience as a friend to you. Um, to me, it feels like talking to the same 12 people over and over again, like different iterations or almost like different interpretations of the same archetypes over and over. So there are larger archetypes, which are temperamental archetypes, of which some are rare s- and others are very common. And most people carry very common archetypes, like about 70-80% of the human race, very common archetypes. And so even within, you know, those differences that we have, these differences are rarely encountered, right? So let's say out of 8 people you meet, one of these 8 people will be some sort of rare or uncommon archetype. And when we say archetype, we mean in temperament, in deterministic behavior, and stuff like that. So it's very rare to meet someone who doesn't fit into a stereotype. So just because you don't know about a stereotype or a behavioral template that comes with a certain, stereotype or physiognomy archetype, it doesn't mean that they don't belong to a stereotype, right? So you might meet someone and you might intuitively just know, like, oh yeah, this is that kind of person that I've met before, and he's probably very temperamentally close, which is funny because they're also genetically close. And it's even more funny when you understand that people from different genomes, from completely different lines of genetics, um, they also carry the same archetypes, right? So it could be from one nation that is the farthest from another nation. So you get two people from these nations or cultures, and one could be like a predominantly like white culture, and the other one could be like an Asiatic culture or whatever, and their archetypes will literally be the same, right? They will obviously have the sort of like the genetics based differences and the cultural differences that come with them, but the energetic archetype is very similar, right? Now this isn't always the case, and the reason I sort of like say this as a disclaimer is, um, we have to look at people as sort of like open books, and we have to look at them as, things that carry infinite possibilities when it comes to behavior. But we also that shouldn't also keep us from looking at them as, you know, machines that are incredibly predictable or can be incredibly predictable, right? So when we talk about, like men and women and gender and I talk a lot about this because I feel like the largest wound of Western society, in particular, but not just Western society, is how it treats its sexual divide, right? The largest wound it is unable to heal is the divide between its masculine and its feminine, and that divide is almost, there's such a big gap between those two energies right now that it's almost like an inversion of the two genders. And I feel like looking from the outside in, like we're looking at a society and culture that is in the process of this inversion. And because it's in the process of this inversion, they have a massive blind spot. They're not conscious of any of these changes occurring. And I honestly, I'd be lying if I told you I know exactly how this is going to unfold because on this scale, it has never happened before. So it can happen on like a family scale or like a cultural scale, but on a national on a national or international scale, it's never occurred before. So when we talk about predictability, right, we usually talk about the individual. But if you take 100 individuals that are all extremely predictable, you cannot predict even the individual's behavior anymore, right? Because now they've become a part of the whole, and the whole is led usually also by a single individual, right? And the predictable patterns of that single individual overshadow the predictable patterns of, well, everyone else who's basically like living under their shadow a little bit. But to get back to, the average person on the street, when you're studying human behavior, it's very important to not lose sight that they're human. Like I literally mean that, because on the highest level of, let's say, deterministic sort of like behavioral patterns, it's you can reliably predict 95% of all behavior in basically anyone. It's very rare that some people have like very hybridized archetypes or hybridized faces. These are usually souls who are, or consciousness, or bodies who carry consciousness that are that have passed significant stages of spiritual evolution, and they're harder to read. So the harder a person is to read, chances are, right, that they're highly conscious and aware, right? But most people are not. So when we say, let's say, in sense of face reading, you go to a bank and you see a specific person with specific features or physiognomy features, and not just physiognomy features, right? Like mannerisms, their body type, so on and so forth, curvature, everything has meaning, right? um and you ask me like, hey Uncle Jack, which person in here is more likely to be a robber or the robber? Like, let's say there's a robber 110%, we know that in the bank. You can put your finger on a person and you'll most likely 99.99% you'll be right. This is because behavior, the primary determining factor for behavior is temperament, right? And high level psychologists know this, especially when they work with different types of people. Most psychologists don't know shit about this, but people who have a lot of experience on the field. So I'm not talking about theoretical psychology. I'm talking about field experience, when you've like literally seen and have worked with people who carry different archetypes and then mix and match and blah blah blah. So they know this. Temperament is the primary driver of behavior, especially on surface behavior. So when we talk about, well, in my first face reading course, for example, we talk a lot about how different features that show different temperaments control behavior on a day-to-day basis, right? Or for example, if I went up and I slapped someone in the face on the street, sort of like by studying their features, I will know what their reaction will be, and there's not really that many, which is so funny. um and it's a little bit dehumanizing, but it's true. Okay, and we are at the pursuit of truth, so we don't want to like make it seem like it's not as predictable as it is, because it is. Like, let's say we have someone with physiognomical features that we know that if I slap this person, right, the first impulsive reaction, and this is all impulse, by the way. It's not aware, because like you can't come into awareness of being attacked in the very first second. It's completely intrinsic, right? So when I slap someone and I know that, okay, like intuitively and instinctually and by right by any logic or any database or reference of past experiences they have, they're going to immediately retaliate, right? There are people like this. Then I have another person who I know that actually, like, if I slap that person, right, um, they will try to reorient and retreat. And when I say the word retreat, like people, always take it as like, ha ha, like he ran away. No, no, no. I don't mean run away. I mean, that is someone who will reorient and relocate their body, like literally physically, to better study the threat. So to better understand what the threat is, so that they might attack you with more vicious efficiency, right? There's a type of person, um, who, let's say you go up and like slap them or whatever, um, and they will immediately, how to say, shell up, right? Right? Um, and all of these behaviors are very, very easy to predict. So, let's say someone who has a lot of curvature on their face against someone who has very sharp features, right? Very, very sharp, like triangular features, right? Those are the sort of like the radical ends of behavior like this, right? You would say, well, okay, if I slapped a person, right, who has like, curved features, they're probably like, like run back a little bit, they'll look at me, they'll study my body, they'll take everything in, and then they'll choose their plan of action. Now you can, and obviously the other guy who's like the absolute opposite of that is like, okay, they're just going to brainlessly retaliate because that's all they know, right? And both of these things could be, you know, very lethal, right? One is instinctive retaliation, the other is instinctive sort of like studying of the situation. That's a scary thing too, right? And the reason these archetypes do this, like let's say, on a behavioral sense, is self-defense, right? So, where the body and the instincts behave in a way where they feel like they have the edge over others. And your body and your archetype already knows this, right? It doesn't give a shit about your opinion. Your opinion doesn't matter. Um, it is already sort of like designed to have this. So let's say if I'm a better and quick and more creative thinker than the person attacking me, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to do my best to create more space and physical distance, but also more time between our next interaction or engagement in the physical altercation, because I know that within those 5 seconds in between, so within those 5 seconds of downtime, let's call that, my mental acuity will outperform theirs, most likely. And because it does, I need to buy myself more time to calculate. And then when I calculate, I know I can kill them, right? Um, and the other way around, if someone has a lot of sharp features, right? Um, they won't they won't go this way, right? Because they don't want to calculate. They immediately want to act, right? Because that's what they're good at. They're good at instinctive action or reaction, right? They usually have like, you know a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber, right? So these physiognomy archetypes also relate to how the body is constructed as well. So anyway, these are like, there's temperament, and then there's the sort of like the genetic predisposition of the mind and body that drives most of human behavior. Um, and then because of these predispositions, it drives most of human desires. So if you understand what someone desires, and if you understand what kind of behavioral template they're working with, it's very, very easy to even manipulate them or hypnotize them or entrance them or whatever you want, basically, right? If you're someone without morals, right? Or someone with loose morals. And the reason I say this is because people are very vulnerable to being controlled, like on an emotional level. This is why, let's say for me, or yourself, or someone who's, you know, at the pursuit of the spiritual and more tolerance and more love and that type of thing, we have to be aware that we don't live in a world that responds safely to our desires of spiritual growth, right? While we have the ability and the capacity to shape our immediate, surroundings, we can't forget that there are, hundreds of billions of other individual souls on this planet who have their own agency, and who are able to enact the same sort of like agency in the material realm as we are, even if they're not aware of it. And most of them are unaware of it. So let's say I'll go to somewhere. Yeah, I went to I go to this Christian church here sometimes when I have time. Um, Wonderful place. They do like traditional chanting there, and I'll go there sometimes to relax. Nothing like overly dramatic in a spiritual sense. It's nice to be there. The energy is good, right? And then I'll go somewhere and I'll walk into sort of like the store that's just outside the church, and they're selling like church items and yada yada. And let's say there's like an old lady sitting in there, and it is such a trivial, mundane, everyday occurrence for her. Like someone walks to the door, and what do you want? Blah blah. I'm just reading my newspaper. She's not there, right? And I'm sure you guys have experienced this as well, where you'll meet someone and right, and you just know that their awareness is just not there. Like they are there in a well, in a physical sense, but you have to say a few magical words, I guess, to summon up or conjure up their awareness of, do you know of the behaviors you're expressing right now, right? So I can say something strange to them. I call them summoning words, right? You can say something that's very evocative to a person to really al- allow them to center their fleeting, how to say, awareness, right? If they're in someone in the past, or if they're someone in the future, or if they're usually containing their awareness of their emotions. So like the most basic soul, or the basic consciousness, let's say, usually they only have the power to become conscious of their emotions. So they're retaining most of their attention in their emotional body. So when I ask someone, well, how do you feel? They can cast their awareness, the light of awareness, onto the emotion, and they can say, well, I feel this way. But if I ask someone, why do you feel this way? They can no longer, most people, they can no longer cast their awareness onto the grander reason behind the emotion that they're feeling, behind the sadness they're feeling, or whatever. So anyway, back to this lady, right? We go in there and I tell her a few magic words, um, right? I ask her a question, right? I ask her a question that demands her um, emotional awareness, right? That conjures it up, right? To for her to become aware of her current emotional state. So let's say she's a little bit irritated, she's a little bit mean. She's not giving me the answers that I want, right? Because I want to ask her, well, hey, I want to come in and want to listen to some chanting. Well, can I go in? Is there sort of like some sort of rule set? Is there a dress code? I want to extract all this information from her, right? But it's not giving, right? Most of the time, because people are, sometimes they're rude, sometimes they're irritating. Um, so what I have to do is I have to ask her a question, or tell her a few words that are evocative enough at that moment for her to become aware of her emotional state. And I'll ask them sometimes stuff like, um, um, I don't even know. I'll ask them a, sort of like a cheesy question like, there's so much to be grateful for, isn't there? Right? Something like that. In her mind, immediately, I can literally see it in their eyes, right? Because the eyes are very indicative of the mental processes. Like when the brain is processing new information, the eyes are very indicative of what kind of processing occurs, right? So usually, let's say on a behavioral sense, she'll look up at me, she'll look at me. First, she'll gauge who I am, right? Okay, then she'll get who I am. If I get a green pass, so people have this moment. This is like a split second thing, where they'll look you up and down, and if you pass, so pass meaning you're not a threat, and you're coming with a genuine question. If you get the pass, then she will allow herself to have her internal moment, right? And this is usually most people. Um, with that level of awareness. So she'll have that internal moment where she'll sort of like her eyes will go dart upwards, and then they'll downwards. They'll go downwards. This means she's retrieving, like she's looking at the abstraction of the question I gave her, the abstract information. Well, she first has to conceptualize what the question is, right? And then she has to conceptualize what sort of like the value and the meaning of the question is, right? So what we did there is we did not do her any favors there, because she's expending more conscious mental energy in order to interface with us on a communication basis. But we have to do this. We have to sort of like invade her psyche a little bit if we want to get what we want, right? So her eyes will dart up. So she's when they do this, by the way, this means they're visually imagining the question. So like the question you gave them, they're visually imagining some sort of imagery or a thought form or a question, that they will have to well, contend with, and then they'll bring it down into the material realm, into their, you know, practical reality. And that's when the eyes go down, right? And they'll go left and right, left and right, left and right. So everything is being put in their place, in its place. She devised some sort of answer. She devised some sort of plan, some sort of attitude to interact with you, right? And then she'll read into the emotional weight of the question, meaning, is it a negative experience? Am I having a negative experience, or am I having a positive experience? And this is where projecting and programming comes in. You always want to, let's not call them NPCs, but let's call them people who lack awareness. You always want to interface with these people from a foundational point of positivity, no matter what. So you can, even if they're upset, even if they're irritated, you always want to project positivity regardless of what they say, because sometimes they might double down, and they might, you know, sort of like reply back to you, and might come back at you with more negativity. So let's say in this case it works, and the foundational core is there, the report is there, and she answers us back with, uh, "Oh yes, definitely." Right? There's a lot to be grateful for. And then, you know, sometimes you might get cocky and you might say, "Oh, like, what are you grateful for today?" Right? And this will send her on another roller coaster, right? But you don't want to be manipulative, right? Because at this point, you're not creating a report. Now you're just basically like stealing away some of her, you know, conscious energy. Um, but since the report is done, since you've established yourself as non-threatening and, you know, someone who can conjure up their awareness is yours. So whatever you do with it now in the next few seconds, especially if you catch them off guard, right? In which most cases you do. It's like when a student is sitting at class and they're just not listening, and the teacher tells you something, it's almost like you have to funnel all this awareness into that current moment to like, oh my God, what's going on? Am I embarrassing myself? Am I in trouble? Da, 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 right? So um, it's almost that effect, and it almost gives you a sort of like authority in the next few seconds. So it's very important. Like the first few things you tell a person, but once you know that you've captured their awareness, is very important, because they will use that information to decipher where they are, what is going on, and sort of like what is happening around them, right? So when I do that, and now I have report. My expectation of her is for her to, let's say, you know, be positive and be helpful to me, right? But again, I don't want to be manipulative, right? So now you have to give them a choice, and they will appreciate this, by the way. Most people will, because it means you're not expending their conscious energy for no reason, right? Like intuitively, you know, they still know. So you basically tell them something like, um, um is it all right if I ask you a couple of questions, for example, right? So never ask for permission to talk to someone. Ask the permission to to get what you want. Again, it's very, very, very huge, especially for men. Men always make this mistake. "Oh, can I talk to—" No, shut up. Just stop being a pussy. Start talking and ask for permission to get— can I get permission to get what I want from you? That's what you want to be asking. You don't want to be asking, can I get permission to get permission? It makes no sense, right? It makes you look ridiculous. Again, we'll talk about this later for young men and like how terrible they are at just communicating with other people, including other men, not just women. But sort of like to understand why we do this is because we just gave her a difficult question. Now we want to give her an easy question. This is she's very willing and very able to answer, again, mostly positively. And she's gonna get a little bit of a dopamine hit from it because, like, ha, I know the answer to this question, right? I am smart. So, yeah, it sounds funny when we talk about people like children, but most people are children, like with their level of consciousness and awareness. They are children stuck in an adult bodies, right? So, we give her the opportunity to say yes. I'll tell you why, and she'll never say no. Almost never say no unless it's really prohibited or something like that, right? To ask her questions. Um, if she says no, she knows that we're going to send her on another roller coaster full of negative emotion, most likely, where she will have to expend more mental charge, mental energy. So she's always going to say yes, right? And now she's being useful, right? So you see, like, um 95% of the times you will get this reaction because, well, it's only human logic and human desire to want to feel useful, want to feel like you can provide helpful information to another person. So it's not even about the other person or whether you want to or whether you're willing to, to give information or give out information about something. It becomes about yourself and the things that you tell yourself. Okay, I'm performing well in this social situation. I'm being helpful. Da 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 da. I'm such a nice person. Boom, dopamine rush hits. Right? We call it a dopamine rush. It's not really a rush, but the small amount of dopamine is just like it starts to trickle down. That type of thing, especially effective with women, right? Because they're so attached. Their awareness is so attached to their emotional states. They're very in touch with their emotional states. And then once we've asked for permission, right now, we're a little bit less of a douchebag, and we're not exploiting another soul, right? Um, and now we can start asking the questions, right? Like, hey, when is this? When is that? Um, and in between, you never want to like spam the questions either, right? So you need to make conversation in between, right? So I will again reinforce positive input, or reinforce beauty, because beauty helps you achieve to interface with the highest level of awareness with a person, right? To conjure up the highest positive potential behavior from them. So, for example, I will look at something in the room that I genuinely like. It doesn't have to be a lie, and I will say, "Wow, that is a beautiful painting that you're selling here. It's so evocative, right? It's such a beautiful painting. Does it have a story of some sort, right? And if it does, she'll tell us about it, or if not, like, when you point at a thing, right, and reinforce it with what it already is. So if I point at a beautiful painting and reinforce it with the sentiment of it being a beautiful painting, right? That in general sort of like becomes this mental memento, that we can use as a medium between her and I to not look one another in the eyes, let's say, um, to sort of like interface with or use as a medium to interface with one another. Now I try to avoid a little bit when it comes to eye contact, because it depends like what kind of physiognomy you have and what kind of energy you carry, right? I carry very penetrative energy, so I don't want to be sort of like directly interfacing with people most of the time because it's very overwhelming or it's very intense, right? There are some people who should do a lot of who should do that a lot more. Like some people who have like very like soft, sort of like flowy energies, of which I am often jealous of, admittedly. Um, they can interface with people directly and interface with their souls directly, right? I try to avoid it for the most part, right? But not always. Not always. It has its uses as well to have intense energy. Um, but the lesson behind this is, um, you cannot you shouldn't just predict human behavior. You should also learn how to project or like conjure up awareness to then, project the behaviors you want to get out of another person onto that person, without violating their agency and without violating their choices, right? The only neutral question in, like, let's say the example we had right now is the approval question, right? Like, hey, like, are you okay with, can I ask you a bunch of questions? Are you okay with giving me this information? That's the moment where they can say yes, no. And that's the only neutral question in there. So it doesn't carry a positive connotation and it doesn't carry a negative connotation. And you should always do that. You should always present that question as well. It's just better, because they'll be thankful for it. Um, but if you understand these two things, right, like how temperament affects it, how, actually three things. We haven't mentioned the sentiment of environment. Environment is a massive determining factor for behaviors, and I'll give you guys an example of that too today. But yeah, if you understand those two preliminary things, that sort of behavior is based on um, projected input projected input when awareness is present, and then it's also based on um the deterministic factor of temperament and attitude, right? And if you can read someone's temperament and attitude, and most people, like we said, like 80% of people are supremely easy and simple to read in terms of attitude through physiognomy. um you can basically predict how they'll behave and what kind. Like, I've had interactions with people that have gone, and I still have this regularly, and it's a little bit like funky. It leaves a sour taste in my mouth. But initially, when I could start doing this, when I started doing this, it was very sort of like elating, almost like wow, like I did not think behavior would be this deterministic. But sometimes, again, like I have had interactions with people that word to word, like breath to breath, like interval to interval, like mannerism to mannerism has matched absolutely exactly how I imagine it playing out, right? And that changes a little bit how you view people, right? Um, and sometimes I've had sort of like, yeah, like interaction with people like who are more aware and who are more conscious and more present. They'll be less predictable, and that's great for me. That makes me so happy, right? It's some sort of novelty, right? And usually these are people, again, like we said, who are like a mixture of different archetypes, and like you get a little bit more jazz out of them, right? Most people don't have jazz. Most people are very hip hop, like they're very they're hip and they're hop. They're hip and they're hop, right? Like they're very predictable. Um, so sometimes you want that jazz, sometimes you want that crescendo, sometimes you want that, sort of like extra flavor to come in, and sometimes you don't get it, and it makes you feel very lonely. It makes the shared feeling among people who are highly conscious in this world is probably the most shared feeling is loneliness, and just becoming aware of of how fleeting everything is, the fleeting nature of all things, right? But primarily loneliness, because it makes you feel like you're playing this video game, not so well designed video game, when you can, look at someone or talk to someone and sort of like gauge their behavior that's almost always correct. And sometimes if it's not correct, right, there's also like a predetermined reason for that. So there's sort of like pre-existing situation or narrative or scenario that's going on that you're just not aware of. So it's like something in the background that you just can't calculate with your vision and your senses and your hearing and your mind, or it's some sort of environmental factor that you either did not calculate or just, you're human as well. You can make a mistake. You just didn't sort of like read the room well enough. Um, I'll talk to you guys about environment and how that drives behavior, which is incredible. An incredible statistic that you can study is that most young people today will base their first few sexual encounters in life based on TV shows they watch online, because it's the first, how to say it, it's their introductory concept, or it's their introductory understanding of the concept of sexual intimacy, right? So they will like, what will they do? They understand that, the sexual, intercourse as a thing exists. They have a sort of a concept of what it is, and they have a very small, list of references when it comes to having to simulate that with another person, let's say another youngling, right? And their first sexual encounter is wholly driven on a behavioral level, for the most part, by what they see or what they have seen in like these, I don't know, like teen TV shows or whatever. And that's a terrifying thing, right? That's a terrifying thing, because this is a whole generation that's programmed into certain behaviors. I'll give you another example, right, of just how deterministic human behavior is. People nowadays, let's say from, Western media and Western entertainment and so on and so forth, they're programmed into a certain level of cynicism and a certain type of humor, right? They interface with the concept of humor through these popular TV shows, or like, I don't know, like if you're like me, and you're like, I don't know, like 25, 30, 35, or anything like that, like you might have watched a lot of Cartoon Network, right? And most of your ability for humor comes with by interfacing the humor of those times, right? And the humor of our times, of modern days for the newer generation, is very different from that, right? So they interface with humor completely differently. So their understanding of humor is completely different. So when they engage with humor with one another, they have a vastly different experience than we do. So let's say you have all these programmed and projected behaviors that people simulate, right? And they become a part of the simulation, right? So they'll not only simulate these behaviors, but they will simulate philosophies and ideas and mannerisms, right? They'll listen to someone like Jordan Peterson, and they'll decide, because that's what the environment is telling them. Wow, Jordan Peterson is very popular and he's very smart. That's what people are saying. So if Jordan Peterson is very popular and very smart, if I sort of like take up some of his concepts and philosophies and mannerisms, then I will be very popular and smart. But it doesn't work out that way, right? Because these are two different people that carry two different energies. Anyway, back to environment affecting behavior, right? Um and this is a great um, there's a great scene in one of the Harry Potter movies. I forget which one. I saw it a very long time ago. It's a great scene where there's this Asian girl, Choi is her name, I believe, and well, Harry Potter, who's the main character. And they end up kissing in the scene. I think it's in front of some mirror or in some magic room or whatever. Um, and it's almost like the environment, they're in this magic room that, gives them what they need at that moment or whatever. And it's like this magical moment where they're suddenly find themselves alone in this like lonely room, and the threat of the evil wizards, killing them all, looms heavily, over them, right? So it's almost like the environment is demanding of sort of like a rich in a ritualistic sense of intimacy occurring, right? You never see this, but you can actually see this in life and how it manifests in life as well. So for example, right, there's I'll give you another example. Okay, I have two friends. They both went to the same, university, right? Both of them are guys. Both of them are very, very handsome, very intellectual young men, right? Especially back in the day. They've put on some weight since then, unfortunately. But they went to the same university. One of them had a great time. One of them had an amazing time, their best years, and the other guy just hated it. He had a terrible time, right? Well, we all know how men measure, right, their experiences in college and university according to, like what kind of relationships they were able to sort of like foster and create, and how many girls they get to have fun with, and so on and so forth. So what was the difference? Because both of these guys, I want you guys to like look at it this way: both of these guys shared a very similar experience, right? They attended the same lectures, they went to the same rooms, they took the same bus to the university. Difference here is one of these guys, okay, one of these guys lived had rented an apartment because they were from another region. They rented an apartment near the campus, and they were staying there alone, right? And the other guy had to sort of like travel like 4 or 5 kilometers or whatever to get to these lectures, right? That was the only difference between these two guys. Okay, so let's say guy number one who had a great time, he tells me, you know what, man, like, like I used to go to the lecture, it was so fun, it was so interesting, right? And then I would, talk to all these people, and they would have all of these, tasks or whatever. I'd meet a girl or whatever, like we'd share our homework, blah blah blah. And sometimes, and most of the times, right, there's a lecture and there's like an interval of time between, and there's another lecture, right? I'd be like, hey, I actually like live right over there, you want to come up, have some coffee, blah blah, whatever. So his apartment, his rented out apartment, would be like this super cool hangout place or whatever. Where my other friend basically like had to, I don't know what he had to do. Right, he was alone during that whole. These two guys didn't know each other, by the way. Just to be clear. So he had like all this time. It's like I have like 3 hours to burn. I have no clue what's going on. Like there's no one in the like the classrooms or whatever. So he's having a shitty time. He's tired, and now he's going to the other lecture, and then just going back home. He's a long trip ahead of him, right? Again, both very attractive men. So my first friend is like, dude, I didn't even have to do anything. It's like the situation, the environment, because let's say, like homework is boring, right? My apartment is boring, right? We're both tired and on our nerves, and I am not boring, and you are not boring, right? What do you think is going to happen in that apartment? Regardless, like whether you're actually attracted to me or not, I am still the most attractive thing in that room, right? I'm still the most attractive thing that exists within the vacuum of that room. So if you had to find something or someone to be attracted to, it would 110% have to be me. It's not like you're on campus where you're seeing all these people, right? And you have like all these things to stare at. So, yes, it's a little bit sad and a little bit sick to talk about human behavior this way. I'm sorry, but it's true. This is how simple it is. Sometimes the environmental stimulant, right, is the primary determining factor of like whether someone will have something as life-changing as first-time sex, right? Sometimes, most of the times, I would argue, that's the primary driving factor. So now when you have this image of of humans of like, well, okay, if I put them in like a church, they will behave a different way because the environment is summoning different uh behavioral programs within them, right? And who projected these behavioral programs? Well, I did. But even if they had no previous programming and I put them in a church, well, symbolically, what is a church? It's massive, right? It has objectively beautiful things within. It smells nice. You understand? Like it's evocative of a state of sort of like this entrancing euphoria, right? Of this calmness and so on and so forth. If I put someone in a nightclub, it conjures up a completely different energy, right? Now, if I put someone in a boring room with a boring person, suddenly that person will stop being boring. They will become super interesting because, at the very least, the standard of the situation has been lowered. And now that person is very interesting because at least I can get some sort of input and output, right? Like a reflection or deflection of my ideas with that person or through that person. So these are the three primary drivers of human behavior. So I'm going to list them again. There's environmental stimulants, which are incredibly underrated. This probably drives like 40 or 50% of all behavior, especially in social situations. The other one is predetermined temperament that drives behavior, which is incredibly easy to read for the most basic physiognomy practitioner. Like if you buy my first book and if you look at those archetypes, which is just like 10% of all physiognomy, you will have a pristine understanding of temperament. Um, so it's even for someone who's like very basic in the arts will be able to sort of like understand temperament or determine temperament from the canvas of the face, or what we call the canvas of the face. Um, and the second one, I believe, which is now the third one that we mentioned, um, is the input that they're receiving from other sources, like the patterns or the projections of behaviors and mimicry and mannerisms and yada yada, that they've sort of like learned. So if you understand cultural significance and if you understand the cultural background, the age-based background, if you understand the environment a person is in and their predetermined, attitude and temperament, you can basically predict like 95% of all behaviors. And that's a scary thing, right? And I'm sure there have been some underground tests and experiments and blah 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 that these elite types sort of like like in a black market way have researched, and especially the Germans in World War II, and even the Soviets and even Americans, right, and the Japanese, right, they have largely why our world is being treated the way it is, why most humans are being treated as cattle, is because these people have no spiritual context of why and how people are so deterministic, right? The only people who are not like predictable in a behavior sense are the ones who have constant awareness. So their awareness isn't fleeting, right? It's constant. And you've met a person like this, I'm sure, and they feel incredibly potent and intense and powerful, right? um I've met a few people like this, right? And it's very rare for me to meet people like this because I myself carry very intense energy, right? So it's very rare that I meet someone where I'm like, wow, okay, I see what you're up to. Um, but generally, what you want to understand is both you and I and everyone else, we are a little bit relatively vulnerable to these types of programs and projections and blah blah blah. But when you're talking about, well, why do women in relations to men, or why do men in relation to women behave in certain ways, it's so predictable. Even the thing I just posted, right? Like Andrew Tate's new girlfriend, who Andrew Tate promised to make his wife, right? Like he beat her up, apparently. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. Right? And she's like, oh well, I still love him, uh, even though he threatened me and beat me up and told me I was his property and blah blah blah. It's so predictable, right? Like you look at it from the side, like, girl, like, what are you doing? Can't you predict what is going to happen and unfold? Maybe she even can, but because she is so dependent, she is so vulnerable to her own like pre-existing programming, and by that I mean trauma in this case, right? And a definitive lack of a father figure. Either she has had no father figure at all, or she has had such a weak and frail and fragile relationship with a father figure, or the father figure was just like not good, not a good presence in her life, that it's almost like if she doesn't become aware outside of her emotional body, this pattern is going to be repeated in her life endlessly, infinitely. Not going to be the first, not going to be the last. And the reason life occurs in this way, both in a spiritual evolution sense and just deterministic sense, is because this is the only scenario, this is the only narrative in which she is forced to become aware of that shadow programming. That is the only way the material realm can unfold. that will entice her and inspire her for the sake of her own carnal, physical, material survival to come face to face with the shadow programming that is being carried in her psyche, right? So, yes, you can call it a blessing in disguise. Yes, you can call it paradoxical, ironic design. Yes, you can call it all of these things. But the truth is, the way people are nowadays in the world and the way things and events are unfolding in the world is because there's no other possible way within the context of spiritual evolvement and like evolution to happen. They can't possibly happen any other way. The all of the bad and terrible things that are occurring in the world and how we can link this to human behavior and lack of human awareness, they're occurring because they have to occur in this very painful, very heated manner for people to finally become present and see these shadow programs within their own selves. So, like I always say, the world itself, the three-dimensional realm, the matrix, or whatever you want to call it, is an input-output system. When you input something into it, it outputs it back to you. It's called a mirror world, right? So, but hold this and put it within the context of like it will output it back to you with the context of it's trying to show it to you. It's trying to teach you about this thing that you can conceptualize but you cannot see, right? So in places, like we always say, in places devoid of light, in places where no light can directly sort of like exist or shine onto, let's say you can't stare into the sun, right? There are only shadows. When you look at shadows, they're indicative of the existence of this light. So it's the same thing, right? Like you need the dark, you need the shadow projection to externalize and externally manifest itself and hit you back, sometimes literally in your face, for you to be able to interface with these ideas and these programs that you carry within your psyche without even knowing them because you're unable to become aware of them. And the more you become unable to, become aware, the more they're going to show up in your life because of your own behaviors, not because of some, um, let's say, some sort of like strange rainbow magic that's occurring in your life, or there's a divine angel sending you these temptations or whatever, because they want to teach you things. That is also true, but slightly different and more complex within the framework of behavior, human behavior. Let's just discuss it on a very basic level. It is literally because you're unaware of the things you are inviting into your life, or the types of people or the types of behaviors you're inviting into your life by literally following the programming in an unaware state. So let's talk, before we finish, let's talk a little bit about, because I get asked this a lot, about female behavior and female psychology, and male behavior and male psychology. Um, while now we know what the primary driving points are, but you have to understand when these two things meet, right? Um, the it's a, and I'm sure you guys have, like, we talk with fancy words now, but you have encountered a couple where you see them and they're very happy, but for some reason you have this feeling or gut feeling that they're gonna be divorced in like a week or something, right? Like, you just know it's like a ticking time bomb. So at times it's like very apparent. So at other times it's not apparent at all. The reason this occurs is because when these two non-awarenesses clash, right? When two non-awarenesses clash, they suddenly become aware of all the negative aspects of the other, right? They suddenly become aware that, like, the other person, it's not that they have this aspect that they don't like, it's that they become aware of even what they like or dislike in the first place, because they have another person who's very intimate and very private and very close with them, displaying displaying these patterns of behavior repeatedly. And this repeated motion, right, these repeated behaviors are showcased to me on such a baby level, right? So when I see a certain behavior like 50 or 100 or 150 times in the span of 24 hours, right? It doesn't take me much, even like the most non-aware mind, it doesn't take them much to understand, like to hyper focus on and be like, do I like this or do I not like this? And they didn't have any prior information about these behaviors that this other person had, because they're just so non-aware that they're not attentive to detail. They can't read other people very well. They can only find out. Get it? Like, it's not like they can just look at someone and be like, "Ha, I know exactly the type of person this is." No, they're only capable. Their only current capacity is to find out through experience, right? Just like, let's say, Andrew Tate's, new quote unquote wife, right? Or wife to be or never to be, finds out about what kind of person and partner he is, even though there's a slew, there's a plethora of red flags that are just telling you, this is not a good idea, right? Um, Same thing happens in relationships. Especially, I'm known to criticize women a lot, and I'm also known to sort of like push certain ideas, and I get called all kinds of things, by the way, on the internet. Apparently, it gets to a lot of people that I feel like women and men, they should have spiritual and they should have virtuous pursuits. But I also feel that those virtues are manifested differently, right, in both genders, right? But I don't care if I get called certain things, because I realize, like, people who do call me those things, their understanding of behavior and their understanding of human nature as a whole is so lacking, right? That it's not even worth sort of like discussing it with them. They don't even have the foundational knowledge or the reference of experiences to sort of like go along with the talking or the discussion. But for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, um, it's very important that you understand that most people, they will interface with you from their programming. They're not going to be interfacing with you through their conscious awareness, because their awareness is too busy being concentrated on their emotions, on what they feel, what they're currently feeling right now. That's the degree of their awareness. When the awareness grows and the conscious mind expands, that's why we call it expansion. It can expand to topics and occurrences beyond the emotional um, framework, right? Um, when you're choosing a partner, or when you're talking to, like a male or woman or whatever, depending on like what you're into, um, understand that if you are looking to be understood in a relationship, okay, if you're looking to be understood, you have to get into a relationship with someone who first and foremostly understands themselves. If they're unable to understand themselves, they're literally incapable. So you can't be angry at them for this, by the way. They're literally incapable of understanding you because their consciousness does not allow it, right? They can only look at you and stare at you through the filter of how they're currently feeling. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. If I'm feeling irritated right now, you're irritating. Get what I'm saying? Um, Now, growth can happen if you're willing to be tolerant, right? Problem with our world, right? And let's say in this case, women in particular, women are very malleable. They're very vulnerable to environmental projection. Meaning, and I love how this was supposed to be a short space, but we're gonna finish it off here. But very interesting topic. They're very malleable to environmental programming, right? So if I and five of my friends, we go to a bar, right? Um, and we have a plan. Let's say I have a plan, right? Um, this is just pretend we're 18 years old, okay? Like, pretend we're 18 years old, we're really dumb, and everyone is dumb in the bar. Everyone is 18 years old or 20 years old or whatever, really young, really dumb. There's a lot of like hormones and stuff like going on, and five of my friends step into the bar. And there's a bunch of like people are partying, woo, yeah, woo, all kinds of social dynamics going on. And there's like this bunch of girls or whatever, and all they talk about, okay, all they talk about during the first 20 or 30 minutes of their sort of like interaction with these women are like, oh, like our friend, let's say my name is William. Our friend William is so funny. He is the smartest, funniest person we know. Like, we can't wait for him to come in, and we can't wait for you guys to meet him because he's so funny, and he's like always the life of the party, and blah blah blah. And William steps to the door, and he's like, he's terrible, right? Like, he like, let's say, for the fun of it, William is like unhygienic, he's like unkempt, right? He's not in good shape, he's not that smart, and he's definitely not funny. Okay. But if as soon as he walks in, sits on the table, everyone starts like laughing, like all of his friends or whatever. They start laughing, like, ha ha ha! Oh my god, the way you sat down was so funny, dude. Yeah, it was so hilarious. Do you think most of the women in that space would find William attractive or not? Okay. He literally smells bad. Okay. Like, I'm playing devil's out. He literally smells bad. Like, basic hygiene is lacking. Do you think like most women in that bar right now, a little bit tipsy, will they be attracted to him because of the environmental programming for that was done to them for like 20 minutes? So you could be like a strong yes or a strong no or a strong maybe, but I will tell you that 95% of the cases it's a strong yes. And it's ridiculous how that works, okay? Like, it's not my fault, right? It's not my fault, but it's just how the non-aware female mind functions, right? Now, male minds are a little bit more disagreeable, right? But the female mind is constantly looking for agreeableness. And if you're a female listening to this, you might be like, no, I would never. What do you mean? Like, yes, from your current standpoint, because you're here on goddamn X listening to, a very niche, sort of like spiritual growth themed spaces, right? This is not about you. From your current level of consciousness, yes, of course, you would be like, you would detract from this person, right? But for most people, and in this case, most women, it would not detract, because all of the green flags for them, what they feel like are green flags, they're firing. Everyone says they're funny. Everyone says they're rich. Everyone says they're like this and that. So it's not that they even look at it in terms of like, oh, is it a lie or is it a truth? It's not like they look at it from a point of naivety, but they look at it from a point of conformity and uniformity. Most women who are not aware, they love conformity and uniformity because it makes them feel contained within a safe space of predictable behaviors, right? So if all your friends think you're cool and funny and they respect you, right? The thing that's being projected onto me, I start reading. Like, I'll tell you how the manipulation here happens, and this is what Andrew Tate does, and his brother as well. 110%. And it's very basic, by the way. That's why like most of the women who fall for this stuff are very basic and probably very low IQ and very low awareness level. What they'll do is they'll have other people hype them up. Oh, he's such a good person. Oh, he helped me out. He did this for me. And the woman's going to go, oh, I never knew this side of him, and blah, blah. You know what? Actually, he's not that bad. He's not as bad as the X, the Y, Z says. They'll have other people hype them up, right? Their little friends, their core group of wingmen. That's why they need other men around them, by the way. And that's why they'll go out of their way to treat other men and actually do favors for them, because these other men who are pawns and like they're just unaware as well, they're degenerates, they're just, you know being used to create this imagery of like, wow, like the Tate brothers are actually not that bad in real life, blah blah blah, when you get to know them. Anyway, um, what happens then is when you've projected all of these nice and good things into me, because the female mind is so malleable to this sort of stimulant, it starts looking for those things within you. So if you told me that your friend William was funny, right? I am my predetermined behavior is I'm going to start looking for things that are funny into him, where other probably like very average person also display that level of humor or whatever, but they just don't get the luxury of me digging into them, of me fishing for these things to then feed, so that they can feed into my existing biases, right? Oh, he's such a nice person. He's such a great person. What a great person, right? And you start looking for these things, and then suddenly, like every little kind thing you do, right, is reverberated in this wildly delusional filtration system of like, oh my god, I can't believe you petted that kitten. Like, oh my god, like you're such an animal lover, and everyone pets a fucking kitten. Okay. So men who instinctively understand this are highly manipulated. They have no morals, blah blah blah. Their ego is out of place. Um, this is the first thing I would teach my daughter if I had one. Okay, the first thing I would teach them is how men use these sort of like imprints to manipulate, women and yada yada. Now, women use techniques to manipulate men as well, and they're a little bit more complex, right? Because they have an emotional basis. We're not going to be talking about that today, because we already like went over the time. But we're going to talk about that next time. Moral of the story of today's space is, um, think of any non-aware, like some mannerisms or projections or programs that you're unaware of, and think about the magic words, right? The most sort of like high level spiritual thing that I shared in this spaces with you is the magic words. What kind of words can you use to conjure up, to summon the awareness of a person who's usually unaware of anything but how they're currently feeling in that present moment? And then understand how to project, how to program positive emotional reinforcement, positive emotional state within them, to then be able to, I don't want to say get what you want, but just to be able to interface with them on a level of like abstract thought. Think about those things next time. We'll do another little mini space, like a spontaneous one. We'll talk about uh, men. We talked a little bit more about females today. We'll talk about females in relation to men and male behavior, what drives male behavior, and what is um, this whole like sensationalist issue about why are Western men the way they are. Um, that's a very painful topic for me. But nevertheless, it has to be explored. And it's painful because it's pathetic. I hate seeing men who are pathetic, and their patheticisms, and how they're self-inflicted and self-induced. So we're gonna be talking about that next time. All right, much love to everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Buy my shit, support me, whatever, whatever. I'll try to pull out a new the second part of the formulaic face reading soon, but it's a lot of work. So I don't know when that's gonna be out. But if you haven't bought my stuff yet, buy it. I'll be happy for it. Yeah, you'll be helping me build my spaceship. All right, much love to everyone. Hope you have a great day, night, wherever you are. We'll talk later.